Opening the scene at Ashcroft Manor, the music died in an instant. A moment ago, the grand hall of Ashcroft Manor had been alive with laughter, glittering masks, and the lilting sweep of violins. Now silence pressed down like a heavy shroud. On the marble floor beneath the chandelier lay Sir Lionel Ashcroft, host of the masquerade. Only minutes earlier, he had raised a glass to his guests with the pomp of a king. Now his golden mask was shattered into fragments around him, and a dark ribbon of blood ran across the pale stone, catching the chandelier's light in grotesque sparkles. The crowd froze. Dozens of masked faces turned inward, eyes darting, breath quickening behind painted smiles. Whispers slithered through the silence. Dear God, this wasn't an accident. I heard voices, an argument, just before he fell. Each murmur spread like ripples through still water, feeding panic. One guest clutched a jeweled fan so tightly it splintered. Another looked away too quickly, as if terrified their own mask might betray them. No one moved closer. No one dared to touch the body. The grand chandelier still blazed overhead, but its brilliance only deepened the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. Candle wax dripped steadily from the balcony above where the musicians had stopped mid-note, each drop marking time like a sinister metronome. Outside, wind hissed against the tall windows, rattling the panes as if the house itself were warning them. And then, quiet footsteps. From the circle of guests, a small, silver-haired figure stepped forward. She bent over the body, not with panic or grief, but with calm, practiced eyes that missed nothing. The cracked glass still in Sir Lionel's hand, the unnatural position of his arm, the broken mask's jagged edge. She straightened, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Miss Marple was here. Ashcroft Manor had just turned from a ballroom into a crime scene. Somewhere in that glittering circle of masks stood a murderer, someone who had planned this moment with precision, hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's voice, quiet yet cutting, carried through the hush. Accidents don't leave behind so many secrets. Someone here knows the truth, and before this night is over, the truth will speak. Chapter 1. Ashcroft Manor by daylight. Morning light fell differently upon Ashcroft Manor. What had seemed a palace of gold and music the night before now looked colder, sterner, as if the stone walls themselves had secrets to guard. The ivy climbing the facade stirred in the breeze like a restless thought, and the great front doors loomed with the weight of centuries. Miss Marple arrived at the break of dawn, having been invited, if one could call it that, by the sudden tragedy. The household had insisted it was a terrible accident, a misstep on polished marble, nothing more. But Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and calm persistence, knew better. She had seen too much in her long life to mistake chance for design. Inside, the manor revealed itself in layers. The entrance hall stretched upward into shadows, its high ceiling echoing with the hush of footsteps. The chandeliers no longer glittered with gaiety. Instead, they glimmered like cold witnesses. Portraits of long-dead Ashcrofts stared down from their frames, their painted eyes sharp with judgment. The family was gathered, subdued but restless. Lady Constance Ashcroft, widow of Sir Lionel, sat with perfect poise, though her gloved hands trembled against her teacup. Her face was pale, but her gaze darted like a trapped bird. Henry Ashcroft, the eldest son, stood rigidly by the fireplace. His voice was firm when he spoke of honor and family dignity, but his jaw tightened too often, betraying unease. Clara Ashcroft, the younger daughter, appeared delicate, draped in silks of mourning too swiftly chosen. She wept with striking sincerity, yet her eyes, sharp behind tears, lingered on the family lawyer a moment too long. Victor Pembroke, cousin to the deceased and a frequent guest of the manor, hovered in the background with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He seemed to watch the others more than he mourned Sir Lionel. And of course, there were the servants, the butler, Mr. Hargreaves, solemn as ever but overly precise in his replies, the housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, whose silence was heavier than words, and a young maid, Anna, pale and nervous, as if she carried knowledge too heavy for her slender frame. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting needles in her lap, though she did not knit a single stitch. She listened, To words, yes, but also to silences, the hesitations between statements, the glances exchanged when no one thought to notice. The library was her first request. The great room where Sir Lionel had fallen stood much as it had on the night of the masquerade. The spiral staircase rose like a spine of iron and oak, winding toward the upper balcony. Dust motes drifted lazily in the morning sun, falling upon the polished floor where a faint stain still lingered. The broken mask had been removed, the glass swept away, but the air itself held the memory of violence. Miss Marple's eyes did not linger on the obvious. Instead, they caught the details others overlooked. A wax drip hardened onto the rug, though no candle nearby seemed to have burned long enough to leave it. A book on the middle shelf, pulled halfway out as if snatched in haste, or left as a signal. The faint scuff mark upon the oak banister, deeper than a careless scratch, more like the desperate grip of a man fighting not to fall. Lady Constance's voice broke the silence. Inspector claims it was an accident. Lionel stumbled. The floor was slick with wine. What more could there be to say? Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild yet steady. Accidents, she murmured, rarely leave behind so many questions. The words seemed to ripple through the room. Henry shifted. Clara dabbed her eyes. Victor adjusted his cufflinks. Small movements, but to Miss Marple, each was as telling as a confession. She did not accuse. Not yet. Instead, she let the silence grow heavy again, forcing each person to sit with their own thoughts. And in that silence, Miss Marple knew Ashcroft Manor was not merely the scene of a tragedy. It was a house layered with secrets, secrets that had begun to stir, restless, now that death had pried them open. The masquerade had ended, but the true performance was only beginning. Chapter 2. The first suspicion. The corridors of Ashcroft Manor seemed quieter that morning, though not with peace. It was the kind of hush that follows a storm, a silence that waits to be broken. Miss Marple walked slowly through the wide hallways, her eyes tracing the patterns in the stone floors, the shadows cast by tall windows, the hurried glances exchanged whenever a servant passed her way. The library door stood ajar. She stepped inside once more, the smell of extinguished candles lingering faintly in the air. It was here, under the spiral staircase, that Sir Lionel had fallen. The family insisted on calling it an accident. But Miss Marple could not rid herself of the memory of those hardened wax drips on the rug, of the half-pulled book, of the faint scuff marks carved into the oak banister. These were not the careless remnants of a stumble, they were traces of design. She knelt near the base of the stairs. In the morning light, something glimmered faintly. An almost invisible thread of silk caught between the stair rail and the baluster. Pale silver, delicate, like a torn thread from a costume. A masquerade costume. She pinched it gently between her fingers and tucked it into her handkerchief. From the doorway came a voice. "You look as though you expect the stairs themselves to confess." It was Victor Pembroke, his tone light, his smile too polished. He leaned against the doorframe, hands tucked in his pockets. "We are all grieving, you know. Perhaps it is best not to search for monsters where none exist." Miss Marple's gaze was calm, almost kind. "Monsters," she said softly, "rarely appear as such. They are usually quite presentable, even charming." Victor's smile faltered just enough for her to notice. He cleared his throat, muttered something about breakfast, and slipped away. Later in the drawing room, Miss Marple listened quietly as the family spoke of the tragedy. Henry was sharp, defensive. "The inspector has already concluded his report. There is no need for more speculation. Father slipped. That is the end of it." Lady Constance pressed her lips together. "Perhaps," she murmured, though her eyes betrayed doubt. Clara dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, murmuring, "I thought I heard voices in the library before it happened." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Voices?" Miss Marple asked gently. "You are certain?" Clara hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she twisted her handkerchief. "Perhaps I was mistaken. The music was loud. It could have been an echo." But Miss Marple noted the way Henry's gaze cut sharply toward his sister, silencing her before she could say more. That evening, Miss Marple requested permission to walk the manor gardens. Alone among the clipped hedges and statues, she reflected on what she had heard. Clara's half-spoken admission, the silk thread from the staircase, the nervousness of Victor, the tension of Henry, the trembling hands of Lady Constance. One fact was certain. Sir Lionel had not fallen by chance. Miss Marple clasped her hands together, eyes narrowing as she gazed at the dark outline of the manor against the fading sky. Somewhere within those walls lay the truth. And she, as always, would find it, not by force, but by patience, by listening, by watching the tiniest details others cast aside. The masquerade had ended in death, but the performance of lies and half-truths had only just begun. Chapter 3, Secrets Within the Family. The following morning, Ashcroft Manor looked deceptively serene. Sunlight fell across the dew-drenched lawns. Birds trilled from the hedgerows, and yet the household carried the unmistakable weight of unease. The masquerade's glitter had dissolved into silence, and with it, the first whispers of scandal had hardened into suspicion. Miss Marple, seated near a tall window in the breakfast room, knitted calmly while her sharp eyes absorbed the shifting atmosphere. She had learned long ago that the truth of a household rarely revealed itself in grand gestures. It lay instead in hushed tones, fleeting glances, and the odd detail out of place. Ashcroft Manor was full of such details. Lady Helena Ashcroft. At the head of the table sat Lady Helena, the widow of Lord Ashcroft. Her posture was impeccable, her expression coolly composed. Yet beneath the thin veil of elegance, Miss Marple detected fatigue. Eyes slightly reddened, a tremor in her hands as she buttered her toast. Lady Helena spoke sparingly, though when she did, her voice carried an authority that commanded obedience. "Tragedy is a cruel guest," she murmured, "but we must not allow gossip to sully the family's dignity." Her words were aimed at the assembled household, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance Helena cast toward her children. A warning, perhaps, or a plea. Edward Ashcroft. Opposite her sat Edward, the eldest son, broad-shouldered and restless. His jaw was set, his fingers drummed against the tablecloth. He claimed composure, yet the faint flush across his face betrayed agitation. "I cannot believe we're entertaining the idea of foul play," he said, though a trace of defiance laced his tone. "Accidents do happen, even here." Miss Marple did not miss the way his eyes flicked, almost unconsciously, toward the library door whenever the subject arose. If Edward hoped to convince, he chose his words poorly. Beatrice Ashcroft. Beside him, Beatrice, the younger sister, looked pale and distracted. Her beauty was fragile, almost ethereal, but her demeanor suggested unease rather than grief. She toyed with a silver teaspoon, avoiding her mother's gaze. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, hesitant. "Father was troubled lately," she whispered. "I sometimes heard him pacing the corridors at night. Perhaps he slipped?" A convenient explanation, Miss Marple thought, though one delivered without conviction. Beatrice's downcast eyes spoke of knowledge she dared not share openly. Cousin Richard across the table lounged Richard Fairfax, a cousin of the Ashcrofts and frequent guest at the manor. Dressed impeccably even at breakfast, he exuded the careless charm of a man accustomed to indulgence. Yet his glib remarks were undercut by a sharpness in his gaze. "If you ask me," he drawled, "the old spiral staircase has claimed its share of victims. Steep steps, waxed floor, dim light. Rather like an executioner's tool dressed as architecture." His tone was jesting, but Miss Marple noted how his eyes lingered on Lady Helena, gauging her reaction. There was history between them, perhaps financial, perhaps personal, and Richard's debts were no secret in society. The governess hovering near the doorway was Miss Clara Whitfield, the governess to Beatrice. A woman in her 30s, plain of dress but sharp of mind, she blended into the background with practiced skill. Yet Miss Marple recognized her watchfulness, the way Clara's eyes darted from one family member to the next, as though keeping account of their every word. When Helena dismissed her, Clara bowed and slipped out silently. though not before Miss Marple observed a flicker of anxiety in her expression. The governess, too, carried secrets. The butlers and maids, later, during her quiet wanderings, Miss Marple paused in the servants' quarters. Mr. Graves, the butler, carried himself with measured dignity, but the deep lines on his face told of sleepless nights. When questioned gently, he admitted, "My lady insisted the candles be trimmed and lit before the guests gathered. Yet when Sir Reginald fell, I was certain they had been snuffed earlier than expected. I cannot account for it." The maids whispered of seeing Edward storm into the library during the masquerade, his mask still in hand, muttering curses. Another claimed Beatrice had been near tears, hiding in the gallery above the hall. Fragments of truth, perhaps, or distortions born of fear. Miss Marple's silent accounting. By midday, Miss Marple had gathered enough impressions to begin forming her invisible tapestry of the night's events. Each thread was faint, fragile, but together they began to outline a picture of motive and opportunity. Lady Helena. Calm on the surface, yet Miss Marple sensed desperation. Rumors hinted Lord Ashcroft had considered altering his will, a change that might strip Helena of her security. Edward, a man burdened by debt and ambition, his presence near the library too coincidental to dismiss. Beatrice, fragile, secretive, with eyes shadowed by something more than grief. Richard Fairfax, the charming cousin with extravagant tastes, always in need of money. His humor disguised calculation. Clara Whitfield, the governess who saw all, heard all, and perhaps knew too much. A letter revealed. That afternoon, Miss Marple wandered into the library itself, under pretense of examining the scene again. The spiral staircase loomed above her, its polished oak railing catching the pale light from tall windows. At its base, flowers now masked the place of death, but the shadow of the fall lingered. She traced her fingers along the bookshelves until her eyes caught an anomaly, a slip of paper protruding from between two volumes. Sliding it free, she found a letter in Sir Reginald's handwriting. The ink was hurried, the words unfinished. If anything should happen, look to the will. Not all under this roof can be trusted. Miss Marple folded the letter delicately and tucked it into her sleeve. The implications were plain enough. Sir Reginald had known danger lurked within his own household. The gathering storm, by evening, tension at Ashcroft Manor was palpable. Conversation stopped when Miss Marple entered a room. Candles burned lower than usual, their flickering light casting long shadows that danced across portraits of long-dead ancestors. Every eye betrayed suspicion. Edward glared too fiercely at his cousin. Beatrice avoided her mother's touch. Lady Helena, once regal, seemed increasingly brittle under the strain. Even the servants whispered behind closed doors. Miss Marple, outwardly serene, felt the threads tightening. Each contradiction, each subtle glance, wove into a web of deception. The truth was close, but fragile, like a glass bauble suspended by the thinnest thread. Closing note. As Miss Marple retired that night to her guest chamber, she reflected on what she had seen. The Fairfax family was bound by blood and reputation, but beneath their polished veneer lay jealousy, fear, and resentment. In her quiet way, she whispered to herself, "The dead rarely lie. It is the living who twist the truth, and somewhere within these walls, someone has already betrayed it." Outside, the wind howled across the fields of Ashcroft Manor, rattling the old windows as though echoing the secrets still hidden within. The case was only beginning, and Miss Marple knew that by peeling back each layer of deception, she would eventually expose the hand that had turned a masquerade into murder. Chapter 4. Testimonies and Contradictions. By late morning, the ballroom had been cleared of its glitter, but the manor's hush felt heavier than the night before. Inspector Reed took the great oak chair beneath the family portraits. Miss Marple sat a little apart by the window, knitting in her lap, eyes bright and watchful. One by one, the household filed in to give their accounts of the masquerade and of the death that ended it. For the record, the victim was named at last. Julian Harrow, Lady Helena's financial advisor and a frequent guest at Ashcroft. He had been found at the foot of the West Library staircase just after midnight. His mask shattered, a wineglass broken nearby, candlelight guttering in a draught that should not have been there. Lady Helena stood very straight, her black velvet still immaculate. "I retired early," she said, voice cool. "At 11:45. Mr. Harrow came to bid me good night in the blue drawing room at 11:30. Inspector Reed glanced at his notebook. "And after that?" "I went up to my room. I heard the clock strike 12. The scream came. Moments later." She paused. "I did not go down. The guests were in panic. Mr. Graves went." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Your ladyship, the silver travel candlestick from your room. Was it in use last night?" Helena did not blink. "No, why?" "Because one silver candlestick, of the portable sort, was found on the gallery outside the West Library. A draught had nearly snuffed it." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Curious, when all fixed sconces were already lit." Helena's lips pressed together. "Many guests carried candles. I cannot answer for them." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, and made a neat knot in her yarn. Contradiction noted. The blue drawing room's footman had already told the inspector that Lady Helena left the party not at 11:45, but nearer 12, when the first course of champagne was brought back for the midnight toast. And the candlestick's crest was Ashcroft's, worn on the base exactly as the set in Helena's room. Edward Ashcroft Edward came in like a man about to argue his way through a locked door. "I was in the billiards room from 11:50 to 12:10 with Cousin Richard. If this is about money, Harrow and I discussed nothing last night." "Nothing?" Reed asked. "No dispute in the gallery?" Edward bristled. "We spoke. Men do. He advised Mother to place the remainder of Father's investments into bonds. I told him to keep out of family affairs." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "And the small key in your waistcoat, Mr. Ashcroft? To what does it belong?" His hand went to his pocket involuntarily. "A cabinet. Mine." "Not the West Library ledger cupboard?" she asked as if idly. "The one Mr. Harrow sometimes used for balance sheets? The cupboard was locked at 11 but open at midnight. The key to it is a little rather old-fashioned thing. So like yours." Color rose up Edward's neck. "Plenty of keys in this house, Miss Marple." Contradiction noted. The underfootman swore Edward had asked for the billiards lamp to be trimmed at 11:48, after which he was seen crossing the west landing. A smear of the same dark billiard chalk lay, faint but present, on the stair baluster near where Harrow fell. Beatrice Ashcroft. Beatrice looked as if she had not slept. Her perfume was a whisper of violets. Her hands shook. "I went to the loggia for air," she said. "The masks made me faint. I heard a glass break. Then there were shouts." "Alone?" asked Reed. Her eyes flicked toward the door. "Miss Whitfield accompanied me. We returned together." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the hem of Beatrice's gown. "Such lovely silk," she said kindly. "Though the hem caught soot last night. Coal soot, not garden mud. The loggia opens to the rose lawn. No coal there. But the service stairs from the West Library, those can leave a very particular smudge." Beatrice's throat worked. "I must have brushed against something on the way back." "And the note?" Miss Marple asked gently. "The one tucked into the atlas in the West Library. Midnight, come alone. Written in a feminine hand." Beatrice's fingers nodded. "I didn't write..." She stopped herself. "I didn't meet anyone." Contradiction noted. The governess had already hinted Beatrice received a letter earlier in the evening and went white reading it. Also, the coal soot on Beatrice's hem matched a smear on the service stair rail. Richard Fairfax. Richard strolled in with his usual lazy charm. "I was with Edward at billiards. Ask him. We smoked. We argued about a wager. We missed the midnight toast. Entirely harmless." Inspector Reed tapped his pencil. "Harmless, yet you were seen near the West Library door at 5 to 12. Richard smiled. "Looking for a quiet corner. The music gave me a headache." Miss Marple's voice was airy. "And the tiny scratch on your signet ring, so like the bright nick on the west stair baluster. One imagines a ring scraping wood when a gentleman grips a rail very hard. He spread his hands. Perhaps I stumbled. Are we to hang men for clumsiness? Not at all, Miss Marple said. Only we must be clear which gentleman stumbled and where. Your boots, Mr. Fairfax, show a flake of sealing wax caught in the welt. The same dark red wax that sealed Lady Helena's correspondence. One clump of it was trodden at the head of the west stair. Richard's smile thinned. You are very observant, Miss Marple. Contradiction noted. The maid who tends the blue drawing room claimed Richard slipped in at 11:40 when Helena and Harrow were alone. He denied it. Too quickly. Miss Clara Whitfield Clara, the governess, folded her hands tightly. I was with Miss Beatrice on the loggia. We returned when the scream sounded. Reed raised an eyebrow. You left the ballroom together? We did. Miss Marple's tone was soft. Forgive me, Miss Whitfield, but you carry a spot of wax on your sleeve. The dark red variety used on Ashcroft's private letters. She glanced at the governess's pocket. And your pencil, for classroom use, leaves a rigid, upright hand. The note in the atlas was written in a different looping hand. Not yours. But your pocket also holds a broken scrap from a smaller note. Not in writing. Midnight. Curious, is it not, that such a fragment should be in your care if you were only on the loggia? Clara flushed. Miss Beatrice showed me a message she had received. I urged her to ignore it. She would not tell me from whom. And you followed her? Miss Marple asked. I waited at the gallery corner, Clara admitted, voice low. If she met someone, I intended to be close. Contradiction clarified. Clara had indeed been near the West Library. She had not, however, written the atlas note. Her loyalty lay with Beatrice, but her fear was real. Mr. Graves, the butler Graves, stood like a monument. The candles were trimmed at 11. The sconces along the west landing burned for exactly an hour at that height. Yet one was nearly out at midnight, Reed said. Draft? There is no draft, Graves said. Biesi. Not there. Miss Marple lifted her head. Unless the window latch was slipped, she said. It was last night, the left casement. One can open it a finger's width and make a very pretty trick of a guttering flame. Graves's granite face betrayed surprise. I closed it at 11. You did, Miss Marple agreed. But someone reopened it, and someone else, earlier, polished 1 foot of the stair rail. A quick rub with beeswax, the sort used on furniture, leaves a slick invisible to the eye, especially under low light. There is a small swirl upon the wood, where a hurried cloth moved. It sits halfway down the run, exactly where a man, descending, would shift his weight. The butler bowed his head. I know nothing of that, madam. Contradiction noted. Beeswax had been fetched from the still room after 11 by a junior maid for a spill on a console. No such spill was found. The shape of a method. When the door closed behind Graves, Inspector Reed exhaled. Well? Miss Marple's knitting lay folded in her lap. Her voice when she spoke was almost tender. The killer did not push Mr. Harrow outright. That would mark the body in ways we do not see. Instead, they arranged a fall. She held up one finger. First, they lured him. The atlas note, midnight, come alone. A meeting he would keep, for the note promised something he wanted. Perhaps a document, perhaps a secret, perhaps a threat. Second, they set the stage, a casement unlatched to coax a draft. One sconce candle lowered too far, so its wick would shrink faster, and a smear of beeswax on the rail where the hand instinctively reaches. In dim, failing light, a misstep is easy to craft. Third, they chose their vantage, the gallery above, the service stairmouth, the library door ajar, each a point from which to watch without being seen. And they left what they could not help leaving. Soot on a hem, chalk on a rail, sealing wax on a boot, a candlestick of a kind that ought never to have left its owner's room. Reed frowned. But who? Miss Marple's eyes were kind. The plan belongs to a mind that knows the house intimately and fears what Mr. Harrow could do. Someone who could fetch beeswax without question, who could touch the blue drawing room letters, who could steer a nervous girl to, or from, a midnight meeting, and who, if challenged, would say they had retired, or played billiards, or taken the air. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "We are very close, Inspector. One more piece and the pattern will not merely be seen, it will be obvious." Reed shut his notebook. "And the piece?" "The why," Miss Marple said gently. "Mr. Harrow was more than a guest. He was a lever. Whoever set the scene needed him to fall because a paper, an account, a clause, a name, was about to unseat them." She glanced toward the west corridor where the light pooled in a quiet square of floorboards. "We shall return to the library tonight, in the same light, with the same candles, and we shall watch how people move when they believe no one is watching." Outside, the clouds began to gather again over Ashcroft's lawns, as if the sky itself prepared for the staging of a truth that would tolerate no more masks. Chapter 5. Clues in the Library. The library of Ashcroft Manor was a cathedral of silence. Tall shelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, their spines a solemn choir of forgotten voices. Dust floated like pale motes in the air, disturbed only by the faint creak of floorboards beneath Miss Marple's steady step. The scent of beeswax polish lingered, mingling with the faint metallic tang that seemed to cling to the spiral staircase. Miss Marple had asked for the room to be left untouched since the last inspection. Inspector Reed had agreed reluctantly, though his men had been impatient to tidy away the mess. To Miss Marple, the so-called mess was the crime itself, the murderer's handwriting, etched into wood and wax and shadow. The half-pulled book. She moved along the shelves, pausing at a middle row where a single volume jutted out awkwardly, its spine thrust halfway into the room. A volume of Tennyson, leather-bound, its gilt lettering dulled with age. Miss Marple ran a gloved finger along the gap it left behind. The wood was curiously free of dust, as though something small had been hidden there recently. She leaned in, peering at the shadowed niche, and caught the faintest impression. An edge mark, as if a folded letter had been pressed into the gap. Someone had hidden correspondence here, and someone else had retrieved it in haste. Her mind flew at once to the contradictions in the family's testimonies. Beatrice's nervous evasions, Richard's too polished smile, Edward's key. The missing letter could have held the reason Harrow was summoned here, the bait that drew him to his death, the drips of wax. At the base of the staircase, Miss Marple knelt carefully. The carpet had been brushed, but not well enough to fool her. Hardened drops of red wax dotted the rug in a small arc. She held her breath. The library sconces had burned clean with white wax, but these droplets were crimson, the same shade as the seal on Lady Helena's private correspondence. "Sealing wax," Miss Marple whispered, almost to herself. "Not candle wax." She imagined the scene, someone standing at the head of the stairs, holding a sealed letter, breaking it open in the flickering candlelight. The wax fell, unnoticed in the tension of the moment, but enough to betray the letter's presence. And when the confrontation ended, in violence or panic, the letter vanished. The glove. Her eyes narrowed at the far corner of the shelves. Stooping, she drew out a single black glove, leather, slender enough for a woman's hand. The cuff was stained with wax, the forefinger dusted with coal soot. A curious thing to misplace, Miss Marple thought. Gloves are rarely dropped without their pair being missed. And yet no one in the household had claimed to have lost one. She folded the glove gently, turning it in her fingers. It was less a lost item than an abandoned one, hidden in haste, concealed behind books where the finder might stumble upon it only by accident. The spiral stair. Finally, she ascended halfway up the spiral staircase. Here, where Julian Harrow had fallen, the banister bore a curious mark. A wide smear, faint but visible in the right slant of light. Not a scratch, but a glossy swirl, where beeswax polish had been rubbed hurriedly into the wood. She ran her hand lightly over it. The surface was slicker than the rest of the railing. It was no simple accident of cleaning. This was a trap, a hazard laid deliberately. In dim candlelight, a hand reaching for support would slide rather than grip. Miss Marple descended slowly, her eyes reflecting the cold gleam of understanding. The quiet deduction. By the time she returned to the hearth, Miss Marple had pieced together the fragments into a fragile but undeniable outline. A letter, hidden in the Tennyson volume sealed in red wax, used to lure Harrow, wax traces proving the letter was broken open in this very room. A glove, abandoned, stained with wax and soot, a clue to its owner. The slick banister, beeswax to betray a grasping hand. The killer had not struck Harrow with brute force. They had engineered his fall, weaving subtle traps of light and touch, of paper and wax, of trust and deception. Miss Marple looked around the room, her expression soft yet grave. To the casual eye, the library was quiet, dignified, untouched. To hers, it screamed with secrets. "You wished it to look like an accident," she whispered into the silence. But accidents do not compose themselves with such care. No, this was written, rehearsed, and staged. Chapter 6, Part 1, The Hidden Letters. The storm had broken in the night, and the morning found Ashcroft Manor washed in a pale gray light. Raindrops clung to the tall windows of the library like beads of glass, and the scent of damp earth crept in through a narrow crack where the casement didn't close flush. Miss Marple stood alone in the library, her figure small against the massive shelves. Her gaze fixed on the writing desk that had once belonged to Sir Reginald Fairfax and later to Julian Harrow. The desk was imposing. Oak, with brass handles worn smooth by generations of use. It had the air of authority, as though it had witnessed secrets too heavy for words. She had asked for a moment's privacy, and Inspector Reed, though skeptical, had granted it, muttering something about the old lady chasing dust. He didn't understand. Miss Marple's entire life had taught her that it was precisely in the dust where the truth liked to hide. The uneven drawer. She bent over the drawers, opening each with deliberate care. Most slid smoothly, filled with ledgers, letters, receipts, all ordinary remnants of a life of estate management. But one drawer, third from the bottom on the left, stuck slightly, as though something caught against the wood. Miss Marple tugged gently. The drawer gave way at last with a faint scrape. Her keen eyes narrowed. Inside lay papers neatly stacked, but the back panel of the drawer caught her attention. The grain of the wood was subtly misaligned, lighter in color, less worn. Her hand hovered only a moment before she tapped it with her knuckles. Hollow. With the quiet patience of someone accustomed to darning socks and mending seams, she pressed at the edges until the false panel shifted free. Behind it lay a bundle of letters, tied with fraying ribbon, the paper yellowed with time. The secret bundle. Miss Marple drew them out carefully, her heart steady, though her breath caught. She set the bundle on the desk, untied the ribbon, and spread the letters open like fallen leaves. At first glance, they seemed mundane, correspondence about estate matters, notes from solicitors. But among them, one series stood apart, written in a heavier hand, the ink blotted as though the writer had been in agitation. Sir Reginald's unmistakable signature adorned the bottom of each. Her eyes scanned quickly. The content chilled her blood more than any draft in the old library could. "I can no longer in good conscience leave this estate to those who think only of profit. It must serve a higher purpose. My intent is to alter the will, to divert much of the Fairfax fortune to charitable trusts." Letter after letter echoed the same sentiment. Sir Reginald had been planning to rewrite his will, not merely to make adjustments, but to cut deeply into what his heirs had long assumed would be theirs. Motives emerging. Miss Marple pressed her lips together, her fingers resting lightly on the paper. She thought of Lady Helena's dignified calm, of Charles's thinly veiled anger, of Beatrice's nervous contradictions, of Edward's debts and desperation. To any of them, such a discovery would be ruin. To all of them together, it was motive enough to whisper in dark corners, to exchange glances heavy with suspicion, to silence a man who dared undo generations of expectation. And yet, Julian Harrow was the one who died. Why? She read on. One unfinished draft lay among the others, Sir Reginald's pen trailing off mid-sentence. "I know one among them has already discovered my intent, they will stop at nothing. The ink broke, a blot of finality, as though interrupted. A knock at the door, a sharp knock startled her from her thoughts. Inspector Reed stepped in without waiting for her permission, his brow furrowed. "Well, Miss Marple?" he asked, a trace of impatience in his tone. "Any luck with your rummaging?" She smiled faintly, slipping the letters back into their bundle. "Luck? No, Inspector. But truth, yes. I believe we are beginning to glimpse why this tragedy took place." Reed frowned, but she held the bundle just out of his reach. "These letters may not only explain Harrow's death, Inspector, but also who feared what he represented. For if Sir Reginald intended to alter his will, then Julian Harrow's presence here, his knowledge of these letters, may have threatened someone's fortune." Reed's eyes sharpened. "Are you suggesting the heirs killed him to keep their inheritance intact?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said softly, "that greed, when cornered, often lashes out. And sometimes it dresses itself as accident. The first shape of truth." The inspector muttered under his breath and left, clearly troubled. Alone again, Miss Marple returned to the desk. Her eyes lingered on the final draft, with its chilling half-written warning. The letters gave her more than a motive. They gave her a timeline. Sir Reginald had been silenced before he could finalize his changes. And Julian Harrow, whether he discovered the letters or threatened to expose the truth, had met the same fate. The pattern was clear. The deaths were not random. They were the pruning of threats, carefully executed by someone with much to lose. Miss Marple tied the letters once more, her hands steady, though her heart told her that the next step would be far less tidy. She had uncovered the reason for murder. Now she would have to uncover the murderer. Chapter 6, Part 2. Reading between the lines. The air in the library seemed heavier after the discovery of the hidden letters. The grandfather clock ticked with an ominous regularity, each sound like the beat of a gavel marking time toward revelation. Miss Marple sat quietly at the oak desk, spectacles low on her nose, the bundle of letters open before her once again. She did not read them for information this time. She read them for rhythm, for hesitation, for ink blots, for the way the hand trembled more in some sentences than in others. Sir Reginald had been a man of authority, not given to second guesses. Yet his drafts revealed fear, real, gnawing fear, a subtle pattern. She noticed it first in the wording. One among them has already discovered. Not "I suspect," but "I know." That was certainty, not paranoia, which meant Sir Reginald had seen with his own eyes that one of his family members had unearthed his intent. But who? Miss Marple thought back to the testimonies. Charles, the eldest son, had sworn he spent the evening walking in the gardens. Yet the gardener had noticed muddy footprints near the side door of the library, roughly the same hour the fatal accident occurred. Charles had always been impatient with his father's caution in financial affairs. If Sir Reginald cut him out, his ambitions would collapse overnight. Lady Helena, dignified widow, spoke with calm certainty that she retired early. But her maid whispered differently, that her lamp burned until nearly midnight. Helena had the most to lose in reputation. To her, a will diverting wealth away from the family was not just financial ruin, but social humiliation. Beatrice, fragile and hesitant, had contradicted herself too many times. First she heard footsteps, then she claimed it was the wind. Her nervousness was palpable. Was it fear of what she'd seen or guilt of what she'd done? Edward, the cousin, had debts pressing in like wolves at the door. He had motive enough to silence anyone who threatened the inheritance he desperately counted on. Each testimony had been a stone in a wall of lies. And now, the letters were the cracks. Wax and ink, Miss Marple leaned closer to one page, where a faint smudge of candle wax had fallen across Sir Reginald's writing. A candle in the library. It matched the dripped wax she had found on the floor near the spiral staircase. This was no coincidence. Someone had read these letters under the dim light of that candle. Someone had returned them in haste, clumsily, before arranging the accident that silenced Julian Harrow. She looked again at the glove she had found hidden behind the bookcase in Chapter 5. It was no longer just a misplaced accessory. If the letters revealed motive, the glove revealed opportunity. Whoever had been in the library that night had fumbled enough to leave behind a trace. The quiet interrogation. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited the family one by one into the library, under the pretense of returning personal effects. She never accused. She simply let the silence weigh upon them until they filled it with words of their own. When she showed Lady Helena the bundle of letters, Helena's lips thinned, but her eyes betrayed nothing. Still, her hands trembled faintly when she reached for the teacup. Charles laughed too loudly when Miss Marple mentioned the phrase charitable trust, as though mocking it, yet his laugh had the brittle quality of glass about to shatter. Beatrice paled at the sight of the half-written line. "They will stop at nothing," she whispered almost to herself. He knew, before clapping a hand to her mouth. Edward glanced at the letters, then away, his jaw tightening. He muttered about family business being private, but he refused to look Miss Marple in the eye. Each told her something. Not facts, perhaps, but tremors of truth beneath the surface. The first deduction. That evening, as twilight painted the windows in shades of violet and gray, Miss Marple sat once more by the desk. The storm had passed, leaving the manor eerily quiet. She pieced the puzzle together slowly, like knitting a pattern. The letters proved motive, the threat of disinheritance. The candle wax and the glove proved presence in the library. The contradictions in testimony proved lies spoken to conceal that presence. One of them had been here, one of them had read the letters by candlelight, dropped wax upon the page, hidden a glove in haste, and then arranged a fall that killed Julian Harrow, who had seen too much. But which one? Miss Marple closed her eyes, hearing again the tone of voices during her quiet interrogations. Charles's bravado, Helena's restraint, Beatrice's slip, Edward's deflection. The answer was there, not in what they said, but in what they could not help revealing. Toward the truth, she gathered the letters back into their ribbon, her decision firm. The time for quiet observation was ending. If truth were to be forced from shadow into light, it must be staged, carefully, in the very place where death had struck. Her gaze shifted to the spiral staircase, its curve vanishing into the dimness above. How many secrets that staircase had kept? Footsteps in the dark, whispered arguments, perhaps a hand reaching to push. "Very well," she murmured softly. "If this crime was written in shadow, then we shall read it aloud in the light." The plan was forming. She would summon them all, set the scene as it had been, and watch. Guilt has a way of betraying itself when the stage is rebuilt. Chapter 7. Part 1. Gathering in the library. The great library of Ashcroft Manor had never felt so suffocating. Once a sanctuary of polished oak, rows of leather-bound volumes, and quiet intellectual pride, tonight it had become a stage for truth, or for ruin. Miss Marple had summoned every member of the household just after dusk. The long curtains had been drawn, plunging the room into a half-light illuminated only by tall beeswax candles. Their flames wavered in the draft from the tall windows, casting restless shadows that seemed almost alive. The spiral staircase loomed in the background, a sinister silhouette against the flickering glow. More than one pair of eyes strayed nervously toward it, as though expecting Sir Reginald Fairfax, or his ghost, to descend once more. Setting the stage, Miss Marple, seated in the carved oak chair near the desk, looked fragile and grandmotherly, her knitting bag placed primly at her side. Yet the stillness of her figure carried the gravity of a judge about to open a trial. "You may wonder," she began gently, "why I have asked you here tonight. But you see, crimes, real crimes, do not hide in darkness forever. When a scene is recreated, when the lies are told again, the truth has a most inconvenient habit of showing itself." Her words were not loud, but they rippled through the room like a drop falling into still water. Charles shifted impatiently near the mantelpiece, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Edward lingered by the drinks cabinet, pouring himself a brandy he scarcely tasted. Beatrice sat near her mother, Lady Helena, her pale hands twisting nervously in her lap. The servants, Mrs. Dunlop and the butler, kept discreetly at the back, though their eyes never left Miss Marple. Reenactment one by one, Miss Marple directed them to take the places they had claimed during their testimonies. "Charles," she said softly, "you told us you were in the garden, though someone saw you near this very door. Stand there, if you will, by the side entrance." Charles muttered something about pointless theatrics, but obeyed, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "Lady Helena," Miss Marple continued, "you insisted you were in your room, but your lamp burned far into the night. Stand, please, at the foot of the staircase. Imagine the moment you came down to seek your husband, perhaps." Helena's nostrils flared, but she complied with icy grace. "Beatrice, my dear," Miss Marple said more kindly, "you told us of footsteps, sometimes, then not at all. Would you sit once more where you did that night by the hearth? Try to remember what you heard, what you feared." Beatrice lowered her gaze and sank into the armchair, her figure dwarfed by its high back. "And Edward," Miss Marple said last, "you said you were in the billiards room. Yet certain debts may have given you reason to be here. Stand by the desk, if you please. Yes, just so." The tableau was set, each player placed in the position of their own words, their own contradictions. The clock ticks. Miss Marple stood slowly, her small frame framed against the shadows of the shelves. It was here, in this very room, that Sir Reginald fell, but he did not fall by chance. Look around you, the wax upon the floor, the glove behind the case, the letters he wrote in dread. Each of you has seen some part of this puzzle, though none will admit it. The grandfather clock struck the quarter hour. Its solemn chime filled the silence, echoing up the staircase. Several in the room started, as though the sound itself accused them. "Let us walk through it," Miss Marple said firmly. "Sir Reginald was lured here, by words, by threat, perhaps even by one of these very letters. He came, candle in hand, down the staircase. Someone waited, someone who feared what would happen if his intentions became known." The first crack. Her eyes moved from one face to the next, lingering not long, but long enough. Charles's jaw clenched. Edward stared into his glass, his knuckles white. Helena's poise was iron, but too rigid, as though she feared to breathe. Beatrice trembled, tears close to the surface. "You see," Miss Marple continued softly, "truth is like wax on the page. It drips however carefully you try to hide it." Beatrice let out a strangled sound, part gasp, part sob. All eyes turned to her. I heard Father that night," she whispered. "I told you I wasn't sure, but I was. He cried out. He called someone's name before he fell." The room froze. Even the candle flames seemed to lean closer. "Whose name, child?" Miss Marple asked gently. Beatrice's lips trembled. "Charles," she breathed. "He cried Charles." The tension rises. Charles exploded, his voice sharp as breaking glass. "Lies! She's hysterical. She's always been. You'll believe the ramblings of a girl too frightened of her own shadow?" But even as he spoke, his boots echoed against the floor. He had moved instinctively closer to the staircase, closer to the very place where his father had fallen. His movements betrayed him more than his words. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly before her. "Perhaps so, yet a frightened girl has less reason to invent a name than a guilty man has reason to deny it." The silence that followed was electric. Somewhere deep in the house, the wind moaned through a chimney, like a sigh from the past. Miss Marple's eyes flicked once more across the gathered family. The reenactment was only beginning, but already the threads of deception were unraveling. The truth, she knew, was very close. Chapter 7, Part 2, Shadows Unmasked. The silence following Beatrice's trembling words seemed to stretch into eternity. The only sound was the restless flicker of the candles, their shadows crawling across the paneled walls like silent witnesses. Charles's face flushed crimson. "She lies," he thundered, his hand clenched so tightly the veins bulged. "Father never called my name. She wants to protect herself by pointing the finger at me." But Miss Marple, seated serenely, did not flinch. Her soft voice cut through the room with more force than any shout. "Curious, Mr. Fairfax. You are quick to defend yourself, yet no one has accused you but your sister's memory. Why so eager, unless her words strike too close to truth? The weight of her question hung heavy. Lady Helena's eyes darted nervously between her children, while Edward swirled the untouched brandy in his glass, watching the confrontation with a hunger that betrayed his own fear. The candlelight test. Miss Marple rose, slowly, her small frame suddenly commanding the entire chamber. She took one of the tall candles from its holder and placed it on the desk. On the night Sir Reginald died, this room was lit only by candlelight. Flames play strange tricks. They reveal and they conceal. She motioned to Edward. Stand by the desk where you claimed to be earlier, and Charles, return to the base of the staircase. Reluctantly, they obeyed. Miss Marple moved the candle, first to the far corner, then beside the staircase. The light shifted, throwing Edward's face into darkness while illuminating Charles's features in stark relief. You see, Miss Marple murmured. From the library door, one might swear Edward was not here at all. Shadows are a liar's best accomplice, but wax does not lie. She pointed to the hardened drips near the fallen chair. These drops fell from a candle moved hastily. Someone carried light toward the stair, precisely where Sir Reginald met his end. Edward's nervous fumble. Edward set his glass down with a sharp clink. So, what if a candle was moved? That proves nothing. Anyone here might have done it. His voice cracked at the edges, betraying strain. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as steel beneath her gentle smile, did not leave him. Indeed, anyone. Yet only one man smelled of melted wax when he gave his testimony. Edward froze. The brandy glass slipped from his damp fingers, shattering against the hearth. Beatrice gasped. Charles let out a bitter laugh. You see, it was Edward. He was skulking here that night, waiting to rob Father blind. But Miss Marple lifted a hand. Not so quickly, Charles. Innocent men panic when cornered by guilt not their own. Edward's debts gave him reason to scheme, yes, but he lacked the courage for violence. His lies were those of a coward, not a killer. Edward sagged, relieved and ashamed in equal measure. The spiral staircase, Miss Marple turned to the looming spiral staircase. The carved oak gleamed in the wavering light, the banister marked with the scratches discovered days before. Sir Reginald clutched here desperately before he fell. These scratches were not from accident, but from struggle. Someone pressed him back, forcing him to stumble. She raised her eyes to the group. It was no ghost, no misstep in darkness. He was pushed. A shudder passed through the room. Lady Helena's hand fluttered to her chest. Beatrice hid her face. The servants exchanged uneasy glances. And Charles's boots shifted once more toward the stairs. His shoulders hunched as if the very shadows accused him. Helena speaks. Enough. Lady Helena's voice cracked suddenly, the mask of calm slipping. Stop tormenting us with insinuations. My husband is gone. What good comes from tearing the family apart? Miss Marple regarded her with sympathy, but did not relent. Because, Lady Helena, your husband believed one of his own was planning against him. His letters told us as much, and I think you knew it. The widow's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Tell me, Miss Marple pressed gently, why did you light your lamp so late into the night? Not out of sleepless grief. No, but because you were waiting for the sound of footsteps, for the quarrel you feared would come. Helena's lips trembled. She sank back into her chair, silent, broken by truth she could not voice. The mask cracks. Miss Marple moved once more toward Charles. Her tone was almost grandmotherly, but her words were precise, merciless. You wished to inherit quickly. Your father spoke of altering his will, and you knew that when those letters reached the solicitor, your future was gone. You summoned him here, under the guise of talk, and when he refused, you forced him down these very stairs. The candlelight caught the sweat beading on Charles's brow. His fists clenched, unclenched. The mask of authority, the bluster of anger crumbled before their eyes. Beatrice sobbed. Edward whispered something inaudible. The servants exchanged grim looks. Charles's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. "You meddling old woman, you don't know what you're saying." But he did not meet her eyes. The turning point, Miss Marple folded her hands, her voice calm as still water. "Oh, but I do. And when the time is right, I will prove it, piece by piece. You see, lies may shield you for a while, but shadows cannot last when light is turned upon them." The clock chimed again, slow and deliberate. With every toll, the walls of deception seemed to close in. Charles turned away, jaw clenched, shoulders heaving. Lady Helena wept silently, her tears glistening in the flicker of flame. And Miss Marple, serene, watched them all as though the truth were already hers, simply waiting for them to admit it. Chapter 7, Part 3, The Culprit Revealed. The library had grown stifling. The air was thick with candle smoke and fear. Everyone stood frozen in their appointed places as though actors waiting for the curtain to fall. But Miss Marple knew. The curtain was about to rise, revealing what had been hidden in shadow, the final demonstration. She moved to the spiral staircase, her steps slow but steady. Her hand rested lightly on the polished banister, fingers tracing the slick patch of beeswax. "Sir Reginald did not trip," she said softly, but her words carried to every corner of the room. This surface was tampered with, rubbed to be smooth as glass. A hand here, in failing light, would slip. And at that moment, a single push was all that was needed. Her gaze drifted to Charles. "You were near him that night. Beatrice heard his voice call your name. The wax, fetched from the still room, was taken by your request. And the glove, hidden behind the shelves, bore the faint scent of your cologne." Charles opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple raised her hand. The letter from her knitting bag, she drew the bundle of letters. The ribbon was still frayed, the pages marked with Sir Reginald's handwriting. She held one up to the candlelight. "This letter," she said, "was his unfinished testament. In it, he names no one. But in his final words, before the ink blot, he writes, 'I know who has discovered my plan. They will stop at nothing.'" She let the silence stretch, then turned. "Charles, it was you who rifled these letters. You who left wax dripped across the floor. And you who could not bear your father's intent to disinherit you." The collapse of denial. Charles's voice broke into the stillness. "Rubbish," he barked, though his hands shook. "It could have been Edward. He's drowning in debt. He'd do anything. Or Mother. She couldn't risk losing her place. Why single me out?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her words were merciless. "Because it was your father's voice that Beatrice heard, calling your name. Because it was your hand that bore the chalk mark from the billiards table, left upon the stair rail where you steadied yourself. And because when grief struck this household, you were the only one whose tears never fell." Charles faltered, his jaw clenched. He looked around, desperate, but found no ally in the room. Lady Helena whispered, broken, "Charles, tell me it isn't true." The final push, Miss Marple's voice sharpened. "Julian Harrow knew too much. He had seen the letters, perhaps even warned your father he would take them to the solicitor. You lured him here with a note, and when your father intervened, you saw only one way out: silence them both. But the push you gave was not meant for Harrow alone. It was your father who struggled, your father who called your name, your father who fell." The words struck like stones. Confession Charles's composure broke. His shoulders sagged, and his fists unclenched at last. His voice was low, raw, filled with fury and despair. "He would have ruined us," he spat. "Ruined everything my name stood for. Generations of Fairfax pride scattered into the hands of beggars and strangers. He called it charity. I called it betrayal." He lifted his head, eyes wild. "I only meant to frighten him, to make him listen, to make him stop. But he slipped so fast, and then Harrow saw, and he had to be silenced too. I had no choice." The room erupted with gasps. Lady Helena covered her face with trembling hands. Beatrice wept openly. Edward swore under his breath. The verdict. Inspector Reed stepped forward, his jaw set, but Miss Marple lifted a hand once more. You had a choice, Charles. Always a choice. But greed blinds more surely than darkness, and pride can kill faster than poison. Her eyes, though gentle, pierced him. Your father sought to leave behind not wealth, but decency. And you, his heir, chose instead to leave behind blood upon the stairs. Charles sank into a chair, defeated. His confession hung in the candlelit air, heavy and irrevocable. The aftermath, Reed gave the order quietly. The butler fetched his men, and Charles Fairfax was taken from the library, his head bowed but his eyes still burning with unrepentant fire. When the door closed behind them, silence returned. The only sound was Beatrice's sobbing and the steady, unrelenting tick of the clock. Miss Marple gathered the letters once more, tying them with their ribbon. She placed them gently back upon the desk. Justice, she murmured, rarely comes without sorrow, but it comes. Chapter 8. The full confession. The rain had returned by the time Charles Fairfax was escorted through the heavy oak doors of the local constabulary. The lamps glowed weakly against the storm outside, their light falling across his pale, drawn face. Gone was the swagger of the Fairfax air. In its place was a man cornered, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow. Inspector Reed led him into the interview chamber, a stark room with a single table and 2 chairs. Miss Marple, at the inspector's invitation, sat quietly in the corner, her knitting bag at her feet, though her needles remained untouched. Her eyes never left Charles, calm and steady, as though she had been waiting all her life for this very moment of truth. The silence before, for a long while, no one spoke. The tick of the wall clock was the only sound. Charles sat slumped, his fingers tapping nervously on the tabletop. Finally, Reed cleared his throat. Charles Fairfax, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. You have been arrested on suspicion of the murder of Sir Reginald Fairfax, your father. You have already spoken words in the library that amount to an admission, but we will have this matter set down properly. Now is your chance to speak plainly. Charles's lips curled into a bitter smile. Plainly? You want the truth, Inspector? I doubt any of you can stomach it. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice a gentle thread weaving through the storm of tension. Truth rarely spares us pain, Mr. Fairfax, but it frees us from greater torment. The first admission. Charles exhaled, a sound half laugh, half sob. I didn't plan it as murder, he began. I planned it as a lesson. Father was a tyrant, unyielding, cold. All my life I fought for his approval. Yet in his final years, he turned his back on me. Do you know what it is to learn that everything you were promised, the estate, the name, the legacy, would vanish into the hands of strangers? Charity, he called it. Betrayal, I called it. He slammed a hand onto the table, then immediately recoiled as though ashamed of his own anger. I found the letters. I saw the will he intended to change. He meant to cut us all out. My mother, my sister, me. Generations of Fairfax reduced to nothing more than a footnote. Inspector Reed remained impassive. So you chose to stop him. Charles's voice dropped. I chose to scare him, to make him see reason, to corner him in the library and demand he destroy those damned letters. I never meant to kill him. The candle and the wax, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. And yet you prepared. The wax on the banister, slippery enough to turn his grip into air. The candle snuffed out so the room fell into shadow at the crucial moment. Those were not the instincts of a son seeking only to reason with his father. Charles flinched, his eyes darting to her. It was precaution, he cried. He was strong, even in age. Do you think he would have listened to me? No, he would have thundered and raged, cast me aside like always. I thought if he slipped, if he stumbled, he might remember his own mortality. I never thought he'd fall so far, so fast. Julian Harrow. Inspector Reed's tone sharpened. And Julian Harrow? Did you intend to frighten him as well? Charles's expression darkened. His jaw worked silently before he spoke. Harrow was meddling, always meddling. He fancied himself a man of conscience, waving those letters like a badge of honor. He threatened to expose Father's plan before the will was signed. Worse, he threatened to expose me. He saw me in the library that night. He heard the struggle. He knew. His voice cracked. I couldn't let him speak. Not after what had happened, so I struck him, a single blow. He fell quiet, and I thought, perhaps it would end there. But of course it never does it? Once the first stone is cast, the avalanche follows. The glove and the book. Miss Marple's gaze fell upon his trembling hands. And the glove, Charles? Left behind the shelves, stained with wax and dust. You hid it, but clumsily. Why? Charles laughed hollowly. Because I was a fool. In that chaos, I didn't think. My father lay at the foot of the stairs, Harrow unconscious beside him. I panicked. The glove slipped as I shoved the candle back into place. I thought I had hidden it well enough. But you... He looked at her with mingled awe and hatred. You see everything, don't you, Miss Marple? She inclined her head slightly. Not everything. Only what people leave in their haste. Guilt makes careless hands. The final confrontation. The storm outside rose, wind rattling the window panes as though echoing the storm within Charles's heart. He lowered his head into his hands, his voice muffled but clear. I didn't want to kill him. I wanted him to fear me, to see me not as a boy begging for scraps of pride, but as a man. But when he fell, when he called my name, Charles's shoulders shook. I heard it, the plea, and I let him fall. I could have reached for him. I could have pulled him back. But I didn't, and that is murder enough. Inspector Reed nodded grimly. He closed his notebook with finality. Then let it be recorded. Charles Fairfax, by your own words, you stand guilty. Miss Marple's closing words. Charles was led away, his steps dragging, his eyes vacant as though the weight of his confession had hollowed him. The door shut behind him with a heavy click. For a long moment, silence filled the room again. Then Miss Marple spoke, her voice low but steady. Pride and greed, she murmured. They blind more surely than darkness. Sir Reginald sought to leave behind virtue, but his son chose vanity. And so one legacy is ended and another begins, written in sorrow. Her eyes lingered on the rain-slicked window, as though she could already see the shadows of the next storm forming beyond Netherfield. Chapter 9. Epilogue. The Last Secret of Netherfield. Ashcroft Manor stood silent in the pale morning light, its stone walls glistening from the night storm. The echoes of the previous days, raised voices, shattering confessions, and the fall of a once proud heir, had faded into a heavy hush. The great estate, once so full of whispers, seemed to breathe again, though its breath was heavy with sorrow. Miss Marple walked slowly through the corridors one last time, her steps soft on the thick rugs. She paused in the library, the heart of the tragedy. The spiral staircase stood still and solemn, as if bearing the weight of all that had happened. On the desk lay the letters of Sir Reginald Fairfax, now sealed into evidence, their ink still carrying the tremor of a man betrayed by his own blood. The widow's farewell, Lady Helena sat by the window, her figure silhouetted against the gray sky. Her hands, once so steady, now clutched a folded piece of parchment Miss Marple had given her that morning. It was the last unfinished letter of Sir Reginald, the one never meant to be found. In it, he wrote of regret, not for his fortune, but for the coldness with which he had ruled his family. He ended with words that seem to hang in the air even now. If my wealth is to vanish, let it vanish in kindness. But if my family is to endure, let it endure in forgiveness. Lady Helena's tears fell silently onto the page. For all that had been lost, her husband, her son, her peace, these words were a fragile mercy, a sister's burden. Beatrice, pale but resolute, stood near the hearth where she had once listened to footsteps and whispers. She looked at Miss Marple with eyes that no longer trembled. You were right, she said softly. Truth does not heal all wounds, but lies. They poison every corner they touch. Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. Truth is often bitter at first, my dear, but it clears the way for life to grow again, even here. Beatrice nodded, clutching the small cross at her throat. Her future would be heavy with memory, but at least no longer shackled by silence. The manor endures. Inspector Reed joined Miss Marple at the door as she prepared to leave. He glanced once more at the grand hall, where portraits of stern-faced ancestors looked down from the walls. "Do you ever wonder, Miss Marple," he asked quietly, "if places like these will ever be free of shadows?" She considered for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Shadows are stubborn, Inspector, but so is light. The two dance forever, and sometimes it is enough to know we've tipped the scale, even just for a little while, a final glimpse." As she stepped into the morning air, the village beyond Netherfield stirred awake. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that reflected the first shy rays of sunlight. Miss Marple paused at the gate, looking back at the manor one last time. Somewhere in those walls, love and cruelty, pride and regret had battled and left scars that would never fully heal. Yet life, she knew, would go on. Servants would open the shutters, gardens would bloom again, laughter would one day return. But the memory of betrayal and of justice found would remain forever etched into the stones of Netherfield. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter against the breeze. She had no illusions that this was the last such mystery fate would lay at her feet. Somewhere in some quiet village or grand estate, truth was already stirring, waiting to be uncovered. Her eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips as she murmured, "Evil may hide in silence, but it always leaves a trail, and someone must be there to follow it." And with that, she turned toward the road that led away from Netherfield, her figure small yet unyielding, as timeless as the truth itself.